The phone buzzed against the granite countertop at 11:47 p.m., and I almost didn't look. I almost let it sit there, screen down, the way I'd trained myself to do for the better part of a decade in this house. But something about the rhythm of it, 3 short buzzes, a pause, 1 long one, made the hair on my arms stand up before my brain caught up with why. My name is Marcus. I'm the kind of man who reads vibration patterns like other men read weather. 14 years in construction will do that to you. You learn to feel things before you understand them. A beam that's about to give, a foundation that was poured wrong 8 months before the crack finally shows. I felt something that night before I had a single fact to hang it on. Vivian was asleep upstairs, or she was supposed to be. I'd kissed her goodnight 40 minutes earlier, watched her roll onto her side the way she always did. Robe still on, phone already face down on her nightstand like a small, deliberate ritual. I told myself for years that the face-down phone was just tidiness. That night, standing alone in our kitchen with my own phone buzzing for a text that wasn't mine, I understood that ritual differently. I just didn't know how differently yet. I was 36 years old. I owned Hartwell Construction. No relation to her family. Just a coincidence of name that used to make her father sneer every time someone asked. I'd built it from a 4-man framing crew into a company that pulled $5 million a year in contracts across 2 counties. Vivian and I had been married 7 years. Before that, we dated for 1, against the wishes of her father, Desmond Hartley, a man who owned half the commercial real estate in town and had never once, in 8 years, called me by my actual name. I walked to the counter and looked at my phone. The notification wasn't a text to me. It was Vivian's phone, charging on the counter where she usually left it overnight. Except tonight it had buzzed loud enough through the wall that my phone, sitting beside it, had registered the vibration through the shared surface. A trick of physics. A coincidence I would later understand wasn't a coincidence at all, because nothing that year was. Picked up her phone. The screen was lit. The preview line, before it disappeared into the lock screen, read, "Don't come tomorrow. He's suspicious." I stood there in the dark kitchen for what felt like a long time, holding a phone that wasn't mine, reading 4 words that would later feel like the first crack in a foundation I'd spent 7 years standing on without ever once checking what was underneath it. I want to be honest about something before I go further. I didn't open that phone that night. I told myself I respected her privacy. I told myself a lot of things that year that, looking back, were really just me choosing the version of reality that let me keep sleeping at night. That was the truth about me if I'm being fair to myself the way I wasn't fair to myself back then. I have always been a man who would rather carry a weight quietly than ask the question that might set it down. My father was the same way. He worked himself into an early grave rather than tell my mother he was scared of losing the hardware store. I used to think that was strength. I'm less sure now. Vivian and I had a good life on paper and mostly off it too. She managed the front office for a pediatric practice in town. Loved by every parent who walked through that door. The kind of woman who remembered which kid was scared of shots and which one needed the dinosaur stickers instead of the stars. We had a house with a wraparound porch that I'd built the frame for myself. 2 dogs. A habit of Sunday morning coffee on that porch that I genuinely believed neither of us would ever give up. But that spring, something in the rhythm of her had changed. Small things. She started taking calls in the garage instead of the kitchen. She'd come back and smelling faintly of her father's cologne. That specific, expensive cedar and leather scent Desmond had worn since I'd known him, and explain it away as having stopped by his office to drop off paperwork for the family trust. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Desmond owned half the town. It made sense that his daughter, his only child, would be in and out of his orbit. "You okay?" I asked her one night in April, watching her stare at her plate without eating much of it. "Just tired," she said. "Dad's been difficult about the Restwood project." She meant one of his commercial developments. She'd been helping him with paperwork on and off for years. Another thing I'd never questioned, because it seemed harmless, even sweet, a daughter helping her aging father with his business. I didn't ask what kind of difficult. That was my first real mistake, though I wouldn't understand it as a mistake for months. I had built an entire marriage on the principle of not asking the second question. The first question, "You okay?" I always asked. It was easy, low stakes, the kind of question that lets you feel like a good husband without requiring you to actually hear the answer. The second question, the one that would have made her either lie outright or tell me something true, I almost never asked. I told myself it was respect. Looking back, it was fear wearing respect's clothes. My best friend Cole noticed before I did, or at least he said something before I was ready to. We were framing a garage out on Route 9 in May, nail guns going, the smell of fresh-cut pine thick in the heat, when he asked, out of nowhere, "Viv doing okay?" She seemed off at the 4th of July thing. It was barely June. He meant the Memorial Day barbecue. "She's stressed about her dad's project," I said. Cole didn't say anything for a second, just kept nailing. Then, "Her dad's always got a project." I let it go. I had a business to run, a crew of 11 men depending on me, a marriage I had no reason, none that I could point to with any specificity, to doubt. That was the shape of that spring. Small absences I filled in with generous explanations, because the alternative explanation was one I wasn't ready to hold. By July, the pattern had a shape I couldn't unsee, even with my eyes half closed to it. Vivian started going to her father's house on Tuesday evenings, helping him organize his files, she said, since Desmond's longtime assistant had retired that spring and he was, in Vivian's words, hopeless without someone managing his paperwork. She'd come home around 9, sometimes later, hair slightly damp like she'd showered, which she explained as the humidity in his unair-conditioned study. I want to mark this clearly because it matters. There were real, plausible explanations for almost everything. That's what made it insidious. Desmond's house genuinely didn't have central air in the East Wing. Vivian genuinely had always been close with her father, in a way that other people's wives weren't. But Desmond had also always treated me with such open contempt that it seemed natural she'd want to manage him carefully, to keep peace between her husband and her father by absorbing the friction herself. The red flag I missed, and I can name it now with a clarity I didn't have then, wasn't any single Tuesday evening. It was that every time I asked to come with her, to help carry boxes or just to be there, she had a reason it wasn't a good night. "He's not feeling well, he gets embarrassed about the mess, he asked for it to just be the two of us this time." Looking back, that was the moment I should have asked the question I kept swallowing. Why did a grown man, however proud, need to keep his son-in-law out of a room full of file boxes? In August, Dana, a woman who did the books for half the contractors in town, including mine, and who I'd known for years in that easy, professional way you know people who handle your invoices, pulled me aside at a supplier's open house. She didn't say much. Just, "You doing business with Desmond Hartley on anything right now?" "No," I said. "Why?" She hesitated, glanced around the room and said, "No reason." "Forget I asked." But her face didn't say no reason. Her face said she'd seen something in his books that troubled her and had decided, in that moment, that it wasn't her place to hand it to me. I didn't push. Another second question left unasked. That was the same week I found a receipt in Vivian's coat pocket. Not snooping, just grabbing her coat off the hook to bring it to her in the car. For a hotel 40 minutes away, dated the previous Tuesday. 2 coffees, 2 room service breakfasts, checked out at 9 a.m. I stood in the driveway holding that receipt for a long time. The easy explanation, the one I reached for instinctively, like a man grabbing a railing on a dark staircase, was that she'd stayed there overnight with a girlfriend, or for some work thing with the Pediatric Practices Regional Conference. I almost convinced myself of it. I actually opened my mouth to ask her about it that night, words half-formed, and then watched her come through the door laughing at something on her phone, easy and warm and so completely herself, and I lost my nerve. I told myself I'd ask later. I told myself the timing wasn't right. That was the moment, if I'm honest with myself now, that the marriage I thought I had and the marriage I actually had finally and fully diverged. Not because of what she was doing, because of what I chose not to do with the piece of paper in my hand. September is when I stopped being a man who avoided the second question and became, against every instinct I had, a man who went looking for it. Started small. I began noticing the pattern of her Tuesday absences against the pattern of her father's business calendar, which wasn't hard to track. Desmond's office sent quarterly newsletters to half the businesses in town, including mine, bragging about his developments. The Restwood project, the one she said was so difficult, had quietly stalled in June. There was no ongoing paperwork crisis. There hadn't been one for months. I called Dana, not casually this time. I asked her straight out to have coffee, and when we sat down, I told her what I'd noticed and asked her to tell me what she'd almost told me at the supplier's open house. She was quiet for a long moment, stirring a coffee she wasn't drinking. "I do the books for one of Desmond's shell companies," she finally said. "Has for years. There's a property, a condo actually, out past Restwood, that doesn't show up on any of his public filings. Payments going out of a secondary account every month. Utilities under a different name." She looked at me carefully. "I don't know what it's for, Marcus. I genuinely don't. But I know it's not nothing, and I know your name's never been on a single document tied to it, even though you're family." That was a turning point, though I didn't see the whole shape of it yet. I'd been hunting for evidence of an affair. Some man, some stranger, some name I'd never heard. It hadn't occurred to me, not once, not even as a paranoid 3 a.m. thought, to wonder whether the secrecy ran through her father instead of around him. I drove past the condo address Dana gave me twice that week, both times at night, both times seeing nothing but a dark window and an empty driveway. The third time, on a Tuesday, Vivian's car was there, parked beside it. Desmond's silver Lincoln, the one he drove instead of being chauffeured because he always said, to feel like he was still in control of something. I sat in my truck across the street for 40 minutes. I told myself a dozen explanations. Maybe he'd had a health scare and she was caring for him quietly, ashamed to admit her father needed help. Maybe it was some financial matter so sensitive that even I, as her husband, wasn't meant to know the details. Old money families did things like that, kept ledgers private even from in-laws. I want to be honest about the moment my own judgment failed me, the one mistake in this whole search I'd ask the audience to sit with rather than excuse. I went home that night and didn't say anything to Vivian. Instead, I went into her phone the next morning while she showered. The same phone I'd refused to touch back in April out of some warped sense of honor. I told myself it was different now, that I had cause. Maybe I did. But I also know that what I was really doing was avoiding, one more time, the much harder and more honest act of simply sitting across from my wife and asking her, directly, what was happening to us. Her phone wasn't locked with anything I didn't already know. Our anniversary. A code she'd used for years. I found the messages. Not from a man with a new name. From Dad. Years of them. Some affectionate in the ordinary way a daughter texts a father. And then, threaded through them, others. "Don't come tomorrow. He's suspicious. From March. I can't keep doing the condo on Tuesdays, people will notice. From May, a reply. Then Thursdays. We need the time, Vivi. You know that." I sat on the edge of our bed with her phone in my hands, the shower still running down the hall, and I felt something in my chest that I can still feel now, all these months later, if I let myself sit in that memory too long. Not the clean, simple devastation of my wife is cheating with another man. Something stranger, colder, harder to name. The slow dawning, nauseating understanding that whatever this was, it had been built and protected by two people, not one, for far longer than I had any idea. I didn't confront her that morning. I want to say I had some strategic reason for waiting, but the truth is simpler. I didn't yet trust myself to speak without breaking something I couldn't put back together, and some old, stubborn part of me still wanted to be wrong. I spent 4 days reading. Not snooping further, I didn't need to. I just reread the same 40 messages over and over, the way you press on a bruise to check if it still hurts as much as you remember. It did, every time. On the 5th night, I asked her to sit down on the porch. The one with the frame I'd built myself, the place we'd had 100 ordinary Sunday mornings. I thought there was something fitting and something cruel about doing this there. I didn't shout. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect this part of the story to be loud, and it wasn't. I set her phone on the table between us, screen still open to the thread with Dad, and I said very quietly, "I need you to explain this to me, all of it. Don't tell me what you think will hurt less. Tell me what's true." Vivian looked at the phone. I watched the color leave her face in stages. First her cheeks, then something behind her eyes, like a light going out room by room in a house. She didn't deny it. She didn't reach for an excuse. For a moment she just sat there, hands flat on her knees, breathing like she was trying to remember how. "Okay," she finally said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Okay. You deserve. She stopped. Started again. I'm gonna tell you everything. Please don't say anything until I'm done. I don't think I can do this if you stop me. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice enough to speak anyway. It didn't start the way you think, she said. It wasn't some moment where I decided to betray you. It started 3 years ago, the November my mother's health scare happened, the one where we thought it might be her heart. You were buried in the Lindgren contract that month, remember? 12-hour days. And I went to sit with my father at the hospital almost every night because he couldn't be alone with the fear of losing her. And somewhere in those nights, sitting in those plastic chairs, something between us became, I don't even have the right word for it. Too close. Too much like I was the only thing holding him together. He'd hold my hand the way he used to when I was small, and I let myself feel like his daughter again instead of your wife. And one night, when Mom was stable and we were both exhausted and relieved and emotionally raw in a way that didn't make sense outside that hospital, he kissed me. Not like a father. And I didn't stop it. I told myself it was a one-time thing born out of fear and exhaustion, that it meant nothing, that grief makes people do strange things and we'd both go back to normal. That's the lie I told myself the next morning. Getting in my car in the hospital parking garage, makeup smudged, hands shaking. I told myself, this never has to be real if I never let it happen again. I actually believed that. I believed I could fold it up small enough that it would just stop existing. But it didn't stop. He called 2 weeks later, said he needed help with paperwork, and I went, and I told myself it really was just paperwork, even while some part of me already knew it wasn't. The first few months, I kept thinking I'd find the moment to end it, that there'd be a clean exit, a single conversation where I'd say we can't, and he'd agree and we'd go back to being a normal father and daughter. But every time I got close to that conversation, he'd say something about how alone he'd be, how your mother and I are all I have left, Vivi, and I'd feel that old terror I've had since I was 9 years old and he and Mom almost divorced. That terrible, irrational fear that if I disappointed him, he'd disappear from my life completely. I know how insane that sounds, coming from a grown woman. I know it. But I was still that 9-year-old every single time I tried to leave. I got better at lying than I ever thought I could be. The condo was his idea. He said it was safer than the house, fewer people who'd recognize a car in the driveway. I told myself I was protecting you by keeping it contained, like there was a version of this where you never had to know, and that made it almost not a betrayal, more like a wound I was keeping you safe from. I know now how grotesque that logic is. I knew it then too, somewhere underneath, but I'd gotten so good at not listening to that part of myself. The shame, Marcus, I need you to understand the specific shape of it, not just the word. It was the way I couldn't look at our wedding photo on the hallway table some mornings. It was rehearsing, in the car, exactly how damp my hair should look so the humidity excuse would hold. It was watching you build that porch swing for me 2 summers ago, watching your hands, and feeling something in my stomach curl up so tight I had to go inside and run the tap so you wouldn't hear me get sick. It was every single Sunday morning coffee out here, everyone, where I sat next to you and let you believe you had a wife who was fully present, when half of me was somewhere else entirely, drowning in a secret I'd built brick by brick with my own hands. I tried to stop twice. Once in February, I told him I couldn't anymore and he didn't yell. He just got very quiet and said, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you'll treat me when I'm old." And I caved within a week because I couldn't survive the silence that followed. The second time was 3 weeks ago. I told him the same thing, and that time he said something different. He said if I tried to end it now, after this long, he'd find a way to make sure you found out anyway, on his terms, in a way designed to destroy us both. I don't know if he meant it. I don't know if I even know him anymore, or if I ever did, but I was too afraid to test it. I am not going to ask you to understand this, because I don't fully understand it myself. I just need you to know it was never about you not being enough. It was about a hole in me that existed long before I met you, that I let my father fill in the worst, most destructive way possible, and that I let cost us everything rather than face it honestly. I am so sorry, Marcus. I know that word means almost nothing right now. I'm saying it anyway, because it's the only true thing I have left to give you. The porch was silent except for the cicadas. I sat there for a long time before I trusted myself to speak, turning her words over, feeling something in me that had been rigid for months finally, quietly, break. "I need you to leave tonight," I said. "Not because I want to punish you, because I can't sit on this porch with you for one more hour pretending I know who I've been sitting with. She didn't argue. She just nodded, eyes wet, and went inside to pack a bag. The divorce took 5 months. Cole, who'd gotten his law license a decade earlier and mostly used it now for contract disputes on job sites, walked me through every step, refusing to let me sign anything out of guilt or exhaustion, which were the 2 states I lived in for most of that fall. Dana's information turned out to matter more than either of us expected. The condo wasn't only a secret love nest. It was paid for, in part, through one of Desmond's shell accounts that had also been used to underreport income on 2 of his commercial developments. When Dana eventually handed her findings to a forensic accountant working with the county, Desmond found himself facing an audit that became, over the following year, a much larger legal problem than a quiet affair with his daughter ever would have been on its own. I didn't orchestrate that. I want to be honest about that too. Some part of me would like to claim I engineered his downfall as some satisfying final act. But the truth is plainer and less cinematic. He built his own exposure, brick by brick, the same way Vivian had built her secret. I simply stopped protecting either of them with my silence. Vivian reached out twice after the divorce was final. The first time, a letter, asking if there was any version of us that could exist again, even slowly, even just as people who used to know each other well. The second time, 8 months later, a phone call, her voice smaller than I remembered it, saying she'd started therapy, that she understood now some of what had happened to her as a child that made her so afraid of her father's disapproval, that she wasn't asking for anything, just wanted me to know she was trying to understand herself. I believed her. That's the strange part. I believed every word of it, and it didn't change my answer. Some doors don't need anger behind them to stay closed. Mine just stayed closed because I finally understood that staying closed was an act of self-respect, not cruelty. Looking back at that whole year, I can see what I couldn't see then, that I built a marriage on the comfortable, dangerous habit of never asking the second question. I had genuinely believed, the way a lot of men I know believe, that not pressing, not pushing, not making someone explain themselves was a form of love. I understand now it was often just fear, dressed up nicely enough that I never had to look at it directly. A receipt in a coat pocket, a hotel 40 minutes away, a friend's careful half-warning at a supplier's open house. All of it sat in front of me for months while I chose the kinder, easier story every single time. I think about Dana sometimes, how she almost didn't tell me anything at all, how close I came to never knowing. I think about how willing I was to accept he's difficult about the project as a full explanation for months of absence, simply because the alternative required me to risk a fight I didn't want to have. The lesson I carry now isn't really about Vivian or even about Desmond. It's about the cost of comfortable silence, how a marriage doesn't usually collapse in one dramatic night, but in 100 small nights where someone decides not to ask. I sold the house with the porch I'd built. Not out of bitterness. I just didn't want my mornings anchored to that view anymore. Hartwell Construction is doing better than it ever has. I took on 2 new county contracts this spring, and for the first time in years, I'm not building anything around the shape of someone else's secrets. A few weeks ago, Cole and I were framing a porch for a young couple 2 streets over from my old house. The husband, maybe 26, asked me, half joking, what the secret was to a marriage that lasts. I told him the only thing I actually know to be true now: ask the second question. Every time. Even when you're afraid of the answer. Especially then. The cruelest part of what happened to Marcus wasn't the affair itself. It was discovering that the architecture of betrayal had been built by 2 people who were supposed to be the safest in his life, working in tandem, each one's silence enabling the others. What this story exposes, underneath the affair, is how generational fear can masquerade as devotion. Vivian wasn't simply unfaithful. She was a woman reenacting a childhood terror of abandonment, using her marriage as the place where the cost of that terror finally came due. Desmond wasn't simply a predator of opportunity. He was a man who had spent decades training his daughter to equate love with obedience, and who recognized, consciously or not, that her fear of losing him was a resource he could draw on indefinitely. What makes the story more than a simple infidelity narrative is the accumulation effect, the way Marcus's avoidance and Vivian's self-deception ran on parallel tracks for years, each reinforcing the other without either party ever colliding into the truth. Marcus's pattern of not asking the second question wasn't passive. It was an active, if unconscious, form of self-protection, a way of keeping a comfortable version of his marriage alive slightly past its expiration date. Vivian's pattern of bargaining. Just this once, just until mom is better, just until he calms down. Reveals how betrayal rarely announces itself as betrayal in the moment it begins. It arrives disguised as compassion, as duty, as the lesser of two painful options, and only later, looking backward, does it reveal its true shape. The point of no return wasn't the affair's beginning in that hospital parking garage. It was the moment, 2 years later, when Vivian tried to end it and Desmond threatened, however obliquely, to weaponize the truth against her. That's when a private failure of judgment became something closer to a hostage situation. And it's worth sitting with the discomfort of that distinction, because it complicates any easy verdict on her character. She was, by the end, both a person who caused devastating harm and a person trapped by someone exploiting a vulnerability decades in the making. What ultimately collapses in this story isn't just a marriage. It's the fiction of safety that families like the Hartleys depend on, where wealth and reputation function as a kind of camouflage, allowing dysfunction to continue unchallenged for years because no one outside the family circle has the standing or the courage to ask the second question either. Dana's hesitation at the supplier's open house mirrors Marcus's own hesitation on his porch with the hotel receipt. Two people in two different ways, recognizing wrongness and choosing, at first, the path of least resistance. The story's real argument is that silence is never neutral. Every person who suspected something and said nothing became, in some small way, a co-architect of how long it lasted. What stays with me most isn't the betrayal itself. It's how long Marcus carried proof in his own pocket before he let himself read it as proof. That's not a flaw unique to him. Most of us have done some version of the same thing. Held a receipt, a strange phone notification, a friend's half-finished sentence, and chosen the explanation that let us keep sleeping. Maybe that's the real question this story leaves behind. Not how could she, and not even how could he not see it, but something quieter. What are you choosing not to ask right now, because some part of you already suspects the answer? Marcus didn't lose his marriage in one night on that porch. He lost it slowly, in 100 small moments of comfortable not knowing, and found himself again only when he finally let the not knowing end.